So then with bodhicitta, our mind, to the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. Let's see. So we're on the Chittamatrin or Chittamatra or mind-only school. And we're on, just to orient us, right, there's 7 headings under each school, and we're on the 5th heading, the way of asserting object possessors, right? Object possessors are consciousnesses, their mind. There's one. There are also beings who can be object possessors and terms, but here it's minds. And so we're on page 18 for those who are following the text. And where we left off, we had talked about, so we were just talking about types of knowers. And, for the most part, as I mentioned, these are similar to the Sautrantika school. So there's not a humongous amount that we have to kind of go into detail about, but there are a few points still to cover here. The next one is I'll just go on to the text. So it says, so another form of direct, it was going through direct perceivers, right? And then inferential perceivers. And it had just covered, self-know. There are direct perceivers that are sense consciousnesses. There are direct perceivers that are self-knowing. The mind-only school accepts self-knowers. We had covered that. Anyway, another form of direct perceiver is yogic direct perceiver. And remember, a yogic direct perceiver is an experience that happens in meditative equipoise. Right? So in other words, it's not a normal everyday state of consciousness. It's a state of consciousness that's unique to a person who's in meditative equipoise and who gains realization. So according to this school, there are 4 types of direct perceivers. And you'll notice this is different than the Sautrantikas, right? Because Sautrantikas don't accept, for example, a selflessness of phenomena. This school does accept selflessness of phenomena, so that's going to be included, for example. Anyway, so the 4 types of yogic direct perceivers. One is yogic direct perceiver directly realizing subtle impermanence. And just to remind folks, right, they're in Buddhism, when we talk about realizing impermanence, we often talk about gross impermanence and subtle impermanence, right? So gross impermanence is a type of impermanence that we can see quite easily, right? Like, so for example, when you're aware that aging, right, death, things falling apart, there's a Buddhist, right? One of the teachings in Buddhism says, everything that comes together falls apart. Right? If something arises due to causes and conditions, then it will also cease. When you look at yourself and realize you've gotten older, that's gross impermanence, right? When you realize you've gotten sick, that's gross impermanence, right? And so on. That's different. So then subtle impermanence, though, what is that? Just to remind us, right? Subtle impermanence is the realization that things don't last for a second instant. And I remember actually in Geshe Sopa's autobiography, he describes an experience where somebody asked him about subtle impermanence, and he said, like, he pointed out when you look at gross impermanence, you see that, like, say, an object you have, that you had when you were younger and you still have, has gotten older. And then he said, how did it get older? Right? When did that happen? Was there some point between then and now that it wasn't happening? And of course, we don't see that, right? We don't, like, Whereas if you look at yourself from, now as compared to when you were 10 years ago, it's easy to see you've aged. What we don't pay attention to is that we're aging every instant. And one of the commentaries, I liked this point. He said, one Lama said, he said, if you watch a clock with a second hand, which I guess they still sometimes have those, right? You can see the second hand moving, right, continuously, or every second. And then he said, I'll pick an example, like your computer, or even a big pick an object, doesn't seem like it's your cup, your stairs, your wall are the same, right? They're changing every instant. Everything is changing every instant. That's a basic, and another point they make is and that doesn't require some external force, right? In other words, things change. It doesn't have to, like, we sometimes think, oh, what do we say, like on autopsies, they say the cause of death, right? But the cause of change doesn't have to be something external to you, right? In other words, if you arose due to causes and conditions, then by that very nature, you change every instant. And so we can understand, if we actually contemplate that, we can gain a kind of inferential understanding of it. Yogic direct perception of it is where a person gains a direct perception of that in meditative equipoise. Right? And you can see how that would be incredibly transformative, right? You no longer would grasp at things in the way, even if we just think about, actually, like, I'm just going on a little bit here, but like, like when somebody, like, we all know we're gonna die someday, right? But when you're at a funeral, you feel a little different, right? When you're at the funeral of somebody you really loved, you feel different, right? And it shifts your experience internally. Right? Somebody who's realized subtle impermanence, imagine the change for them, right? In other words, they understand experientially, not just intellectually, but to the depths of their being, right? Through direct perception, everything's changing every instant. Nothing is solid. Nothing lasts, right? Things are in a continuous state like that, right? And they understand that therefore beings can die any instant, right? So they relate to other beings in a very different way. They relate to themselves in a different way. They relate to life in a different way, right? Anyway, so that subtle impermanence is very powerful, is one of the points. So here it's not just an intellectual way, it's a direct perception of that. Right? So it's like you're directly perceiving your own process of change and the process of change of things around you. Then the other kinds of yogic direct perception. Another is yogic direct perception directly realizing the subtle selflessness of persons. Right? And so like the subtle selflessness of persons, according to this school, is the same as in the previous schools. It's the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Right, and of course, when a person has a direct yogic perception of that, they're an Arya, right? And if they're a Bodhisattva, they've achieved the first Bhumi at that point. So that's a type of yogic direct perception. Then another type that's listed here is the yogic direct perceiver, directly realizing the coarse selflessness of persons. Right? And so that's the lack of the emptiness or the lack of a permanent unitary independent self, which is a grosser object of meditation. But again, that can be directly perceived in meditative equipoise, and that's what's mentioned here. And then the fourth one is yogic direct perceivers directly realizing the selflessness of phenomena. And I just want to note, right, that if you notice here, right, among the tenet systems we've covered, this is the first one, right, that teaches and that explains a yogic direct perception of selflessness of phenomena. The lower two schools only accepted a selflessness of persons, not a selflessness of phenomena. Here you have this, so it's subtler, right? There's this ability to have a yogic direct perception of the selflessness of phenomena. And just to reiterate, we studied this last two classes, I think, somewhat, but yeah, last two classes. But so just to remember, right, so a yogic direct perception of the selflessness of phenomena. What is the selflessness of phenomena, right? So there are two different kinds of selflessness of phenomena that are taught in the mind-only school. And just as to remind us, right? So one is that things or objects are empty of existing, separate and cut off from, or a separate entity from mind. Right? That they don't exist as external objects, separate from an independent, separate from and of a different entity from the mind. That's the right way to say it. That's one type of selflessness of phenomena, right? And we've covered that before a little bit, right? When we covered the three natures. And then the second type of emptiness of phenomena is that phenomena are empty of existing, this is the way we phrase it, by their own characteristic as the referent for names and terms. So empty of existing by their own characteristic, or their own, by their own characteristic, I'll say, as the referent for names and terms. And I was going to talk about this later, but maybe I'll talk about it here just for a moment, because I didn't really say this part. I just want to suggest something. This is not just to think about, right, for oneself. Is part of what this particular kind of selflessness of phenomena, right? Part of what becomes interesting, so I just want to suggest it, is to experiment with those kinds of selflessness phenomena in your own experience. Because part of the point is, right, realizing those selflessness phenomena should decrease our mental afflictions. Does that make sense? That's why they're taught. They're not taught for any other reason than to decrease and eventually cause a cessation of mental afflictions and their imprints and their seeds and their latencies, you could call them. And that's a kind of philosophical point. But what I wanted to just mention briefly is, so what does that mean, right? So, like, just pick the example. Like, think of an example of think of an example of a time when you felt particularly strong craving or desire, right? And notice, because you have to notice, right, for emptiness, you have to notice the object of negation, right? So I'll give an example. Take the example of if at some point in your life you had a very strong desire for another person, right? And so you think of that experience, right, when you desired another person. And one point is, right, without a doubt, you were experiencing that person, right, and like as existing as a separate entity from your own mind, right? And you wanted, like, there was a grasping at them, right? Here, what this is saying is, wow, in that moment when I was feeling desire, what I was desiring seemed like it existed external to my mind, but it wasn't actually existent as a separate entity from my mind. So the object of desire seems like it exists externally, but it doesn't exist. And it's kind of funny, isn't it? I mean, we all know this in one way, right? I mean, so Shakespeare who said beauty's in the eye of the beholder, I think so, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's a cliche, right? But in Buddhism, what they're getting at is, wow, if it's really just in the nature of my mind, then, like, what's this here, right? Going to humongous efforts, and if it appears due to my karma, right? Like, so in other words, what I'm desiring is an appearance to the mind that's a result of karma. Then what am I doing chasing after something, right? That's what this is getting at in a way. In other words, so we crave for things, right? Whether they're, and anyway, I won't go on and on. I mean, I remember one time Ken Rinpoche was giving an example of that with, like, say, wealth or something, right? Like, in other words, so it's like that right, according to Buddhism, right, what do I say? Nagarjuna has a famous quote, right? Wealth is the result of generosity. And so Ken Rinpoche one time, I remember that he was giving the example where he said, like, so people, like, crave after that, right? But wealth is just an appearance to the mind that's determined by previous karma. And then he made a point, sometimes people think, oh, if you work hard, right? But there are some people who work incredibly hard and don't gain wealth, and there are other people who really don't work very hard at all and have ridiculous and unjust amounts of wealth and so on. And so the point I'm getting at, though, is like, so to crave for things that are just an appearance of the mind, right? And that don't exist as a separate entity from the mind is a cause of suffering. That's what this is getting at. Right? And do you see how, like, it's just saying it just to contemplate how things really appear separate from the mind and cut off from the mind, right? As if they're this external thing. And what this is doing is saying, challenge that perception, question that perception, eventually refute that, right? Is what the mind only school does. And then the other one, it is that things seem to exist by their own entity or by their own characteristic as the referent for names and terms. Right? And there again, right? Like, notice how things appear to you. That's all it's saying, right? Like, so when you see somebody, right, who you know, if you know their name, immediately it looks to your mind as if that, you say, oh, there's Varahi, right? And immediately it seems Varahi exists from her own side, right? As if she exists, and as if she exists by her own characteristic as the referent for the word Varahi. But actually, I suspect that Varahi wasn't given the name Varahi at birth, for example. So how, and some people might call her Kelsan, right? Some people might refer to her as mom, I believe, something, so if she existed by her own characteristic as the basis for the label, then she would appear the same, right? She would always appear as the basis of that label. And then there are all kinds of labels. And part of this, what the teachings on this get at, is like, we have so many labels, right? And all the time, things seem to exist. Actually, just last night, I was contemplating this one, and I was thinking of, like, it's very weird, isn't it? Like, I was thinking of, if you look at Joe Biden now, does he appears to be, like, as to your mind, does he appear to be the president? And is he the president? Does he exist as the referent for the term president from his own side? Did Donald Trump exist as the referent for the term president from his own side? And what we're getting at is what this is looking at, I just want to point out, is looking at your own perception. How do things appear to your mind? You can't understand these versions of emptiness if you don't understand how things appear to you. Does that make sense? So it's getting at two different kinds of appearance. One is this appearance, things appearing to exist external to the mind, cut off and independent of the mind, as a separate entity from the mind. And what this school is saying is that's wrong. They don't exist that way, right? And then the other one is things appear to exist from their own side and intrinsically from their own characteristic, or let's say that, from their own characteristic, or that they seem to have from their own side or from their own characteristics to exist as the referent for my terms, right? For whatever terms my mind is thinking of them as. And actually, and they don't exist that way, right? And and it's very visceral at this point. Like, I was just thinking of a few months ago, I remember, like, there was a person who I was having a difficult time with, and, like, to my mind at that moment, right, to my mind, that person appeared, like, when I thought of them, there was an appearance of, like, disturbingness. I thought of them, and it seemed like they were disturbing from their own side. And then I can remember there was another time where I thought, when that person, a few years earlier, when that person appeared in my mind, I felt, oh, what a nice person, quite pleasant to ask. So at one point they appeared to exist pleasantly by their own characteristic. At another point they appeared to exist disturbing by their own characteristic. And what this school is saying is, right, they don't exist from their own characteristic. They don't exist as either, right? And that's a misperception that causes, and I'm using that example, right, that caused me suffering, right? And they're empty of that. Does that make sense? So that's one form of emptiness, is empty of existing by its own characteristic as the referent for terms and labels, language. Anyway, so this last one, the yogic direct perceiver, realizing self as a phenomena, is referring to those two types of emptiness, according to this school. And the reason I went over that last part is that's a practical application, right? That's something we can do. We can actually look at, wow, like I am perceiving things, my perception seems like it's separate and cut off from my mind. Is it really that way, right? My perception is as if things really are what I say they are in myself, right? In my own private language. That's a term from Wittgenstein. But the language of the language in my own mind, right? Things seem to me to exist out there, to be the reference for those terms and those ideas. And the school is saying they're not, actually, right? And if they were, and again, there are many logical reasons, but if they were, they would appear to everybody the same and to you the same, right? To exist, if something existed by its own intrinsic characteristic, then as the referent of those terms, first of all, they would always be called those terms. Even without learning the term, everybody would perceive them that way and so on, right? I'll say one last point. I think, at least is my experience, is when one gets that, even starts to get that idea, it's disturbing, isn't it? Like, and we live our whole, that we live our whole lives right in that way, feeling like things, not just, thinking and feeling and behaving as based on a misperception. That things exist by their own characteristic according to our labels, when they don't exist that way. And sometimes we think, well, if everybody else would understand, if everybody could see them the way I see them, that would. But the point is like, what's hard is to recognize, no, how I see them is wrong, actually, right? And this school is saying it's always been wrong, right? And that there's always an element of error until you see the thoroughly established nature, which is an emptiness. Only an emptiness is without any error, right? All other forms of perception, even, there are conventionally incorrect forms of perception, but even conventionally correct forms of perception have an element that's mistaken. Only when one has a yogic direct perception of selfless as a person's or selfless as phenomena, only that is totally without error. All other perceptions have an element of error, and in part because they're dualistic, right? Because they perceive, all other forms of perception conceive of perceiver and perceived as separate entities, right? Or experience them as separate entities, and they're not. So that's what the school's saying. So I think I just want to point out, because there are a lot of practical applications to these contemplations that we can use to see if it decreases our mental afflictions. Okay, so that and the reason why I think, it looks to me, this is how I take it anyway, is that Justin Choki Gelson is really covering the point. He's not going into humongous detail on object possessors, but he's covering, in my view, I think what he's basically mainly doing is covering the points that are different, right, from the Sutra school, Sautantrikas, because he already covered it in the Sautantrikas, but he's pointing out significant differences. So the main significant difference here is that there is such a thing as yogic direct perceiver, realizing the self as a phenomena, because, of course, Sautantrikas don't teach or accept a self as a phenomena. They don't ask that question, right? They think external phenomena are external and exist by their own characteristic and exist separate from the mind and so on. So they don't teach an emptiness of phenomena. So that's a difference. And then he makes one final point here, which, I'll read it and then I'll sort of explain it briefly. The last point is about inferential valid cognition. And he says, an inferential valid cognizer is necessarily conceptual. That's easy. That makes sense, isn't it? If it's inferential, it's conceptual. If it is an inferential cognizer with respect to a phenomena, it is not necessarily a conceptual with respect to that phenomena, because although the inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent is an inferential cognizer with respect to sound being empty of being permanent, it is not a conception with respect to that. This is so because if a conception with respect to a phenomena, if it is a conception with respect to a phenomena, the aspect of that phenomena necessarily arises with respect to the inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent. The aspect of the sound being empty of being permanent does not arise. Therefore, that inferential cognizer does not explicitly realize sound to be empty of being permanent. It realizes that implicitly when it explicitly realizes sound to be impermanent. That paragraph takes reading over and over, I think, to get what he's getting at. It's not easy language, but I'm going to try to make it simpler. What he's getting at here really is implicit and explicit, and I'm going to put it in simpler terms for a second, then I'll come back to what he's actually saying. You know, if you are visiting a friend and you walk into the kitchen next to the sink holding your glass and you say, I'm really thirsty. Right? You're explicitly saying, I'm really thirsty. But your friend could reasonably implicitly think you want a drink of water. Right? And so you didn't explicitly say, I'd like a drink of water, but it's implied, right? If you're by the sink, for example. Right? So there are things that are explicitly explicit and there are things that are implicit, right? Is what is implied, is said here, is explicitly said here. Okay, so what he's getting at here is this, is if the person, so what he's getting at here is this, is he's using an example. He's saying if a person explicitly realizes sound is impermanent, right? Meaning it changes, so yeah, sound is impermanent. They're explicitly realizing that, they're also implicitly realizing sound is empty of being permanent. And so I'll give an example of what we're getting at here, right? If you realize, wow, sound changes instant by instant, right? That's what's actually appearing to your mind. Sound changes instant by instant. An implication of that is, therefore, it's not static, right? And what he's saying is, when you explicitly realize the first, that sound changes instant by instant, what's appearing to your mind is the fact that sound changes instant by instant, right? So what's in that same moment, it's not appearing to your mind, oh, it's empty of being static and unchanging and permanent, but that's implicitly realized. And so that's really what he's saying here, is that first of all, so inferential cognizers are conceptual, and that sometimes some way to put it is this, is sometimes what's being realized, there are certain kinds of inferential cognizers that realize things explicitly, and then that means it's actually appearing to your mind. But there are other kinds of inferential cognizers which realize things implicitly. So then you're having a realization, but it's not appearing to your mind directly because it's only implied. That's really what he's saying. So there are different kinds of inferential experiences of inferential valid cognition. Some are explicit, meaning they actually appear to your mind, and others are implicit, meaning it's not appearing to your mind, but it is understood implicitly by that recognition. So that's all he was really saying there. I think I'll just go on to the next section because I think that was pretty straightforward. So I'll just, the next section is brief, but has a lot of implications. So the sixth section is the way of asserting selflessness. And actually, we've already covered this. I just said these things, but so it says here, the way of positing illustrations of the coarse and subtle selflessness of persons is similar to autonomous and below. So what that's saying is just that, actually the way to put that simply is this, is, right, all the tenet systems, autonomous are one of the two sub-schools of middle way school, right? That's the translation here for, Satantrika Majamika. And so what's actually being said here, this is important, maybe it is good to notice this, is that the Prasangika Majamikas, who we're going to get to pretty soon now, almost the Majamika section, are unique in their explanation of what is gross selflessness and what is subtle selflessness. But all the other tenet systems here, so here Judson Chogi Gelson's pointing this. He's saying that all other tenet systems are the same in terms of how they define the coarse and subtle selflessness of persons, right? And so you can remember this from the 5 Bhashikas through the Sautantrikas, now to the Chitamatrans, right? The gross selflessness of persons is the lack of a permanent, unitary, independent self, right? And remember, we said this with what I was explaining about the Vaibhashikas, we said that's an acquired view, right? So it's that, in other words, the view that there is a permanent, unitary, independent self of persons would be intellectually acquired, right? It might be, so for example, if you were taught that there's, Atman, or if you were taught that there's an eternal soul, or if you were taught whatever, something of that sort, and then you came to believe that, and it sort of influenced you significantly, that would be an acquired view, and the emptiness of that view, or the lack of that kind of self, is the gross selflessness of persons, right? That there is no permanent, unitary, independent self. That's a gross kind of selflessness that can be realized. It can be realized inferentially, and it can be realized, as we just mentioned, through yogic direct perception. And all the schools agree on that except the Prasangikas. Then the subtle selflessness of persons, I mean, the Prasangikas do agree that there's no self like that, but they get it a subtler kind. They're emphasizing a subtler kind of selflessness. So then, anyway, the subtle type of selflessness of persons, according to all these schools, from the autonomous through the mind only and down all the way to the Vaibhashikas, is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? And remember, that can either be an acquired view intellectually, or it could be innate, right? And what is an innate or instinct? Innate is instinctual, right? So that means, in other words, that goes beyond the intellectual. That's the self, that's a kind of, the grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self is something that we human beings have in common with all other sentient beings in samsara, right? Every being in samsara has that kind of self-grasping. And actually, remember, like, according to the true aspectarian mind-only school, right? That kind of self-grasping would be the klistamanas, that right, the afflicted mind, right? That grasps, that looks at the alaya vijnana, right? The storehouse consciousness, and grasps at it as being a self, right? It would grasp it as being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, right? So anyway, that kind of self-grasping is the cause of samsara. It's the primary cause of samsara, we could say. That's the ignorance that serves as the primary cause of suffering. And then it says here, so in terms of the ways of asserting selflessness, those are the two, the gross and the subtle, those are the two ways of asserting selflessness of persons. But now, this is, again, of the schools we've covered, this is the first one that teaches the selfless of phenomena. So it says, an illustration of the selflessness of phenomena, for example, the emptiness that is a form and a valid cognizer apprehending that form's emptiness of being different substances. And so that's what I just mentioned, right? That's one of the, so there are two types of selflessness of phenomena taught in the school. And here it says an illustration. So one of those two, it's saying, is, here they give the, and it could be any object, right? But here they give an example of an external form, right? So like an external form, use their term form, right? So whether it be a physical object like a house, or whether it be another person's body or something of that sort, right? So it's that object and the valid cognizer apprehending it are empty of being, as different substances, right? As existing as separate entities, we could say. So that's a illustration of the selflessness of phenomena. And I just went over the second type of selflessness of phenomena, right? Things being empty of existing by their own characteristic as the basis of names and terms. Maybe I'll pause there before going on to the final section and ask if there are any questions before I go on. Okay, good. There's something else I was going to say. Maybe I won't I was going to say more, but maybe I don't need to complicate things. Oh, sorry, Lynn, did you have a question? Go ahead.
You know, when you talk about it, I can understand it as a system of being or a system of thinking, of being, but then I can't fit it into the intersection of my life and what I do. In other words, in individual instances, I can see, okay, if I have this view, it would be, I can understand it in my life. But in some broader aspects, I can't. You know, it's like, you know, I do civil rights work, okay? So there's all kinds of discrimination. So when I see someone discriminating, whether it's race, gender, sexual orientation, and hurting someone, it's hard to see that as empty because it's hurting someone. So you have your compassion and your, you know, the values on one side, and then you have, but everything is empty. So that's not really what's going on. And I can't sort of merge the two.
I'll say a comment. I mean, I'm not sure if this will help or not, but I'll say a couple of thoughts about it and then see if that, like, one point that's really, I think, worth contemplating is I think you're getting at some important point. Like, one point is to remember, like, that, I mean, to sort of put it in context, right? That the mind-only school, right, this Chittamantran school, so, like, well, first of all, we said it's a Mahayana school of tenets, right? And so that means that the main, right, this school was taught mainly for people actually whose main practice was compassion, is one point, right? So in other words, it was taught to people who whose interest and whose focus was compassion is one point. But then, and now I'm just going to share my own reflection on what you were saying there, like, so this school, first of all, does accept, like, let's say it the right way. So this school is not, first of all, it's not denying, I mean, this school, first of all, obviously, if the main tenet, if the main focus of the school is compassion, one is the school, obviously, a mind-only school, does accept that beings suffer, right? It also does accept that, as we say, right, that other beings have minds, right? Otherwise, you couldn't generate bodhicitta. So it's not saying that everything. It's an important point. This school is definitely not. It's not, what's the word? It's not teaching a kind of solipsism that only my perceptions exist, for example. And so I'll just say, like, how I think a mind-only person. If a person were a practitioner of the mind-only approach to life, how they would think about, how they might think. I don't know how they would think about it, but how they might think about what you were raising is, you can imagine, I can imagine anyway, right, that a mind-only school practitioner who's practicing Dharma would look and would say, wow, like, they would look at beings, right, and they would see, like, wow, if the person hasn't yet realized the emptiness themselves, right, they would realize that they're practicing bodhicitta. They would look and they would think and feel, wow, I and others believe that things exist by their own characteristic according to my labels. And then in terms of, for example, the kinds of things you were just mentioning, they would feel actually, wow, like these, like, you know, they would look at individuals and groups of people and see, wow, these individuals and groups of people are doing that. They're believing that based on gender, based on race, based on class, based on national origin, based on immigration status, based on all different things, right? They're believing, they're making up something in their mind, and then they're believing that those other beings exist the way their mind is labeling. And that's the cause of their hatred, which is the cause of suffering, or hatred or prejudice or racism or all different. I mean, they're all different versions of it. It's not only hatred, right? Arrogance. I mean, they're all different mental afflictions that arise from that. So they would see, well, because they believe that things exist in a way they don't exist, they're giving rise to the causes of their own and others' suffering, right? Of all kinds of suffering. And then they would feel, the Bodhisattva would feel, I myself must free those beings from that ignorance, like that wrongly grasps at how things exist, because as long as they wrongly grasp at that, they're going to create suffering. And so the Bodhisattva would feel like the purpose of my existence is to free beings from that kind of wrong grasping, grasping at things existing in a way they don't exist. And they would feel, I myself first, I must realize that things don't exist that way, so that then I can be more effective actually in helping others realize that things don't exist that way. And, and I will, do all kinds of activities to help beings realize that things don't exist that way. Because as long as they grasp at things existing that way, they're going to continuously create suffering for themselves and each other. And so this kind of way of viewing the world would be the sort of foundation of, first of all, of the basis of their compassion in a way, but also for like their way of intervening in so that, like, ideally a bodhisattva would intervene then to undermine that kind of misperception, because as long as beings have that misperception, they're going to continue creating suffering. So, but I don't know, does that partially answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, legally, in the law, as a lawyer, it's applying stereotypes to people to make them the other, to make them different than you are, so you can discriminate or take the whole pie or whatever you want to do, right? And so that makes a lot of sense. It's the intervention that gets harder, because you usually have to tell the person what they're doing is causing suffering or wrong legally or something, which is a judgment, so you do intervene.
Yeah, no, and in this sense, and I just say, and also, like, if you think of then the Bodhisattva, like the Bodhisattva Precepts, because again, this is a Mahayana school, so it's relevant, is like, it's an important point, right? There are many different guidelines, like, in other words, like, so, I mean, the ultimate one is freeing being, right? On the most subtle level, it's freeing beings from ignorance that is the cause, but I will say that too, like, if you look at, for example, the Bodhisattva vows, they include other kinds of freeing, of liberating people from suffering. And, and they're like part of the Bodhisattva vows, right, are if you have the ability to stop somebody from doing any kind of harm to somebody else, and you don't use that ability, then you're actually harming, that you're not fulfilling your bodhisattva training in a way. So, so it's not only, the most subtle, the most, the most subtle expression of that would be helping beings realize emptiness. But that's not to say that's the only form of expression, like, so in other words, of compassionate activity. And, and even among the, if you look at like even when they say generosity, right, like one of the forms of generosity is if you have the ability to protect any being from harm and fear, to protect them from it, and oftentimes they'll give examples like, if you can stop, like, if you can stop somebody from killing somebody, that's a good thing. But obviously there are many other ways to stop people from harming each other, and there are many other, if you look at all the bodhisattva vows, there are many that apply to these points. So, so I just want to say that too. It's not only, like, obviously here we're talking about tenets, and so we're talking about emptiness, and that's the ultimate sort of way of liberating beings according to Buddhism. But when you're practicing the bodhisattva path, which people on Chittamachan school are doing, the idea is that you do, whatever methods you can apply to decrease beings causing each other harm and fear and pain. It's a bodhisattva practice to do that, for sure. Yeah, so and I'll say that too. Like, I mean, so like I think I think like, for example, the work you do, right, which is trying to stop beings from harm. Well, actually, it's an interesting point, isn't it? I say it the right. We have to be careful how you say it right. Like that's a hard work, which, if done with bodhicitta, becomes a bodhisattva practice, right? I mean, if it's not done with bodhicitta, then of course somebody could do somebody could do any work. Somebody could teach Buddhism without bodhicitta. That's not a bodhisattva practice. So it's, I mean, there's nothing that's intrinsically a bodhisattva practice, but if it's done with bodhicitta, that would be a bodhisattva practice, wouldn't it? And that'd be true whether you're thinking from a Chitta Mantra or Majjhimaka perspective, actually. But yeah, I will say one last point about this, because part of the idea, though, is like, I just want to say this point, because like this is, I think, part of the benefit of the Chitta Matran system. So I just want to point it out, is that when if you really feel this, like that, wow, like in other words, how do you say it, right? That, they swear, I said it, I mean, I'm using philosophical terms for a second, right? That I'm going to call it the imagined nature, or imaginary nature, is empty of existing on the dependent nature, right? And that emptiness is the thoroughly established. Those are the terms, right? But I think experientially, the idea is that when you start to realize, according to the Chitta Matran school, wow, like, in other words, you look at people killing each other, and you realize they're doing it based on something that doesn't exist at all. Like, it's unbearable. The idea is that it would be unbearable, right? Like, that's what a bodhisattva's practice. That's the bodhisattva internally, right? Feels like, wow, like, in other words, people are killing each other or doing whatever to each other, and it's all based on something that doesn't exist at all. Actually, it's completely false. Like, and the feeling, I think, I said, Lama Zopa says, either you laugh or you cry at that point. Like, but it's like, it's an, he said, like, because it's so insane. But the idea is that it's the idea, really, I mean, the term that they use, the Lama Zopa often uses, it's unbearable. Like, when you realize they're doing all of that based on something that's completely, like, that doesn't even, if it had some reality, at least there'd be some reason for it, but it's only out of ignorance. It's only out of believing in something false. And the idea is that that's supposed to, on the one hand, give one a kind of stronger sense of compassion and commitment, but it's also supposed to give one a sense of hope, in a way. In other words, like, because the Dalai Lama often mentions this. He says, if these things were based on reality, if, say, prejudice or so on, all these other things were based in something real, then they couldn't be gotten rid of. And then the Dalai Lama says, but if they're based on something false, then there's hope, right? Because it's just fake. It's totally made up. It's not even, it has no atom of reality, not even a speck of reality. And so then the feeling that the Dalai Lama sometimes expresses, I've heard say, is that then there's hope, because what you're fighting against, it's like, it's like what, anyway, what it was like, if you're fighting with truth against something that's false, then that's a reason for hope, because eventually what's false can become known to be false, and in one's own mind and in the minds of others. So it gives a sense of unbearableness to the process of creating such suffering, but it also gives a sense of hope, because what's false can be overcome, is the idea in the Chitta Mantra or Majjhimaka, because both would say that. Then it's Sujata, somebody, Sujata, you had your hand. Yeah, I can see it now.
Yeah. Just before I ask my question, I just think it's interesting that literally last night I was sitting with some 15-year-olds having a very heated discussion about who are people of color and who are not people of color. And so, and everything that we're learning in this class was really beneficial to me personally in seeing how much suffering was happening in that conversation, and how particularly biracial children feel in relationship to this, looking at all of these different transnational adoptees. Like, there was just a lot of very intense conversation. And I don't know, there's something about being able to hold the two truths simultaneously, that these kids are having experiences around racism and discrimination, and the irritation that they were feeling, that there's ultimately no there, and that they're suffering around something where there's no there, but there was like but there's no there was somehow beneficial. But anyway, it was just, it was a really interesting conversation. And so my question is around direct yogic perception versus explicit cognition. Are they the same thing? I didn't, from the paragraph under the 4 types of yogic direct perceivers, there's this distinction, right, that you were helping us understand between explicit and implicit. And so I think I'm having trouble understanding, or maybe it's just because like I'm so far from either of these things. But when you're, I think I'm trying to understand the difference between an explicit understanding and a direct experience of it. Or is there a difference? Is there an inferential explicit understanding? And so I think maybe some more description around the difference between an explicit, it's still that it's simply conceptual versus direct being experiential. Like you're sitting there on the cushion and you are being the experience, or you're having a direct, like a physiological, or I think maybe some more explanation there would be helpful. Thank you, Lauren.
No, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So one thing is like, I mean, for sure, any yogic direct perception would by definition be explicit, because it's I guess one way of thinking of it is this. So one way of saying it is what you just said, which is that any yogic direct perception is of necessity going to be explicit. It can't, because it's going to be direct perception. But I think the important part, to get to your question, is that as it says here, inferential cognitions are conceptual, and conceptual also implies dualistic. So in other words, so a yogic direct perception in the mind only school would be what's this here? So one way, like, so for like say, I'll take the example, let's take the example of a selfless phenomenon, right? Like, so if you're thinking about like if you're thinking about the selflessness of phenomena, like an inferential valid cognition of that is going to be first of all still conceptual, and therefore also still dualistic, right? There's going to be so it's going to be conceptual. There's going to be some kind of concept of, oh, now I understand. Things lack, things don't really exist as different substances from mind, or something like that. Whereas a yogic direct perception of that is going to be non-dualistic. So it's going to, and they sometimes in the Gita they use this term a lot, like water poured into water, right? There's no sense of separateness in that, So, and it's kind of funny, isn't it? So, if you're having and so there, with inferential valid cognizers, what Jetson Cho Gilson here is pointing out is that they can be explicit realizations or implicit realizations. But yeah, a yogic direct but I guess to put it simply, so their inferential valid cognitions are conceptual and therefore are dualistic in nature. Whereas a yogic direct perception of an emptiness or something, let's say, would be non-conceptual and non-dualistic. So does that get it?
Totally. Thank you so much.
Okay. And then Larry had a question. He's next to have his hand up.
Yeah, you really threw me for a loop when you used the word dualism a minute ago. This is one of the most challenging aspects for me, is that I can understand if I'm in a monastery living and the only outside activity I have is going on extended solo retreats, that I'm not exposed to the all of the things that go on around humans globally, everything from watching news to working to meeting people in different professions. And I've kind of made up in my mind that it's up to me to continue learning, to continue practicing. And over time, if I'm serious and I keep working at the practice, I'll still fail occasionally because I'm not perfect. And I'll keep working at it. And then presumably when I go through this and then come back again, I will continue building on that. The duality part that you mentioned kind of threw me, and it may be just unique to one of the schools, but let's see if I can phrase it. And Lynn began to touch on that, because if you're in a position, really any position working, you're going to be faced with issues of categorizing people, which is a pet peeve of mine that I taught and write a lot about, is that, you know, we look at someone and we all of a sudden decide we make a determination that's we believe to be explicit about a person, and it may be totally an error. And if we're a Buddhist and we're practicing, we're trying not to do that, and we're trying to look at them, and I'm going to use the term generic, I don't know if that's correct or not, but look at them in a way that we would see everyone. And that's really hard to do. And I guess I'm going to pose a question. I don't know if I'm articulating it well or not, but I'll throw it out there. How does one work to improve themselves in doing that, to avoid that? You see the trouble that's going on in the news about bringing people who are really suffering here, and then you see other people complaining about why, you know, all those kind of things, and your mind gets, you know, there's one of the videos I watched where the monk talks about the crazy monkeys running around in your brain and you're trying to get rid of them. And how do you get rid of that? Because it does get crazy after a while. And even when you're like sitting here in a session like this, it's easy for me to focus more. But once I leave and go into the real world, it really gets difficult again. So I'll stop at that, if that made any sense at all that you can answer.
I think it made a lot of sense for one point, but actually I'll share, like, you know, I think there's a lot in what you said, so I'm not sure, but I'll start with just simple. Well, actually, I'll start by sharing something that made me think of, which is, oh gosh, it was a few months ago. I had like a lengthy conversation with Thupten Chodron, who's an old friend, but the Bhikshuni Thupten Chodron, the teacher, Buddhist, you know, well-known Buddhist teacher, and we were talking to some extent about what kind of related to what you're talking about, and I was asking her about her own, you know, she's a law. I mean, I've known her a long time, and her own practice of kind of activism, engaging in the world. She's a nun, but she very much has engaged in the world for decades, you know, in different ways. And I have a lot of respect for her. So I was asking her experience around that. And one thing she was sort of pointing out was that she was saying this point, which I liked and agree with and was contemplating, which is that for Buddhists, you know, what's really helpful is, on the one hand, like, and she was saying this point, she was saying, like, one thing that hopefully is that I don't know if it's unique, but that Buddhists ideally should bring to their engagement in the world, in their compassionate engagement, is a kind of, she didn't use this word, but I'm going to use it, like almost a dialectic or sort of, yeah, a dialectic or a practice of sort of, you go out in the world and you do something, and then you sit on the cushion, and then you go out in the world and you do something, and then you sit on the cushion. And that what she was pointing out was that part of what's wonderful about that is that, you know, let's say thirdly, is that when we engage in the world, it brings up our own projections. It brings up our own mistaken concepts. It brings up our own prejudices, really, I think is the term she used. And then we can sit on the cushion and work through them, was her point. And then she was like, that's how we ourselves make progress, and that we become it. And what she was saying, which I really liked, was that if you do that, she was sort of sharing her own experience, where she was saying, if you do that, then on the one hand, the engagement in the world helps your practice, because it helps you see the things that it helps you uncover your own prejudices, your own misperceptions, your own. And then by working through those a little bit at a time, kind of like what you were saying, it's gradual, it makes you more open and more able when you're out in the world to do a little better the next time. And because you've worked through that little bit of your own whatever that is. So, and yeah, and she was like giving, and I guess I'll say that, like, it was really interesting because she was sort of saying like that, she was making this point, which I liked, which was that sometimes you don't even, like, how do you even know, like, she was making a point to it, which I liked, which was, how do I say this right? I thought it was very touching in a way. It was, she's done a lot of, like she was saying, for example, that she had done a lot of work in prisons, and that given where she grew up and the nature of her family, she would have expected herself to have certain prejudices. And then she was like, oh, I don't have those. But then she got like, then she went to a thing, somebody asked, I guess somebody, and somehow she got involved in helping a person who had been like a part of a motorcycle gang, I guess, or something. And she realized that because of how she had grown up, she had all these prejudices. And when she went to meet that group of people, or some person or people, I can't remember if it was one or group, that all these prejudices arose. And then the actual experience of the person was completely not like what her expectation was based on how she'd grown up, and I guess what I really loved about her sharing that was like, she might never have, in her life, that might never have come up unless the fact that she was engaging out in the world. And suddenly she was like, oh, wow, look at that. I'm expecting this person to be this way and they're not this way. And then she was making the point, then you go back and you sit, you go, wow, look at how I have this. And then you bring to mind, wow, I could come across other people who are, and because they're dressed a certain way, or they have have a certain whatever characteristics, I'm going to assume they're this way. And that's my assuming they exist by way of their own characteristic, in a way they don't exist. And sort of working through that in one's own meditation, and then being like, that was great that came up. Now I get to see my own prejudice and work through it in that example about people who are part of a motorcycle gang or whatever. And then it was like, now she was, I think she didn't say this, but the implication I got was when she sees somebody who's a member of a motorcycle gang, she can smile genuinely and not feel some feeling of, oh, I don't know, whatever one grew up with or something, that was sort of a conditioned response. And so what she was pointing out was that how do you face those unless you engage, and that, but the idea, if you're a Buddhist practitioner, is you use those experiences, whatever they are, right? That whatever we experience, to go, what does this bring up in me? How does that apply to the Dharma? And you go back to the actual teachings of the Buddha, and you see, what is that showing me about myself? How do I personally work through that? And then you go out and you try again. And as you said, it's very incremental. And, like that, I sometimes think that's why they say, Bodhisattvas take 3 countless great eons to become a Buddha, is that it's not quick and it's not easy. But I think that, I guess the last thing I'm saying, this is just my own personal thought, is that then it becomes kind of exciting, isn't it? Like that we can, because seeing what they often say that in Buddhism, Buddhist teachings, that seeing one of one's own faults is more valuable than seeing many faults in other people. And so, yeah, and for me, that's, I think, the biggest benefit to what you're describing, which is, if you're, and I think we have to also, the last thing I'll say, it is my own just soapbox for a second, it's like that we also have to be careful, I think, this is just my own experience, to also balance not overexposing ourselves to things where we get overwhelmed and then can't process it, right? But sort of getting it at the level where, and where something can come up and you can, and oftentimes it's a very visceral feeling that comes up, it's kind of whatever that feeling is. But then to actually apply it, or go sit down and practice our meditation practice around it and go, okay, that's the thing to meditate on. And I think that's how we can make progress. So I think then there's a dialectic between out in the world and then back in meditation, out in the world, back in meditation, where we slowly work through things. And then it's not just intellectualized, it's, our experience of the world helps us to actually have something to meditate on in the cushion. That's profound, then, I think, because it's actually us. It's our own experience. It's not just intellectualized. Does that kind of get it? At least some partial. I don't know. I'm sure it didn't answer all of it, but does that touch on the right territory?
My microphone. Okay, my microphone's working now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was very helpful. In fact, one of the things you said that talking about the nun who saw the motorcycle gang and then she engaged someone and realized that this was not as I expected. And then it also made me think that, again, categorizing the quote motorcycle gang unquote, you can't even do that because there are individuals in it. So she engaged the individual, she learned from that individual, she learned the something about categorizing people, lumping them all into a group, and then went back to grow.
Yeah.
And the other thing you said that help was helpful and it's going to be really challenging for me and probably for others too, is that the society we live in, we expect immediate satisfaction. We expect to, okay, I checked this part of the list and now am I in enlightenment now? When do I get there? And I knew from listening to you and others teach that it's something you have to learn, that the word patience takes on a whole new meaning. And that was, I think, very helpful in explaining that, because you're right, it does get overwhelming at some point, especially if you're engaged in society and watching what's going on and you're just getting overwhelmed, and meditation really does come into play then. So yeah, it was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay. And then Varahi was next.
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of a challenge with the word having no characteristics. And I might be thinking of it too literally. I understand that when we see a characteristic in someone, it's not separate from our own mind and so forth. But still, there is a characteristic. For example, if I'm behaving, the delusions are characteristics. So what are they actually saying? Because if we behave in a miserly way, or we judge people, or even when you gave the example of the nun, she was lumping at that time, but that was a characteristic of hers that she learned about. So how is that not characteristics?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I'm glad you asked that. That was the one point where I said a few minutes ago, I said, oh, I won't make things more complicated. I left it out. So it's good that you asked that. According to this, it's different in the Madhyamaka school than this school. It's one point I'll say. So the meaning of no characteristics or a character, the meaning of that question would be different. I would answer it differently according to each tenet system. But here we're Chinamatran. So the important point here is that actually this school is really interesting, and so this will be more. It makes things more complicated to get into it, but it's good. That you asked is that according to this school, it's actually very. You have to be very accurate. I'm going to try to be very careful how I phrase it because it's complicated, or it could be easy to misunderstand. But according to this school, things do exist by way of their own characteristic, but they don't exist by way of their own characteristic as the referent for terms, for our terms and labels. And so they give an example. The typical example of the teachings would be, they would say, blue exists by way of its own characteristic, but blue does not exist by way of its own characteristic as the referent for the term blue. And so it's a subtle distinction, right? So in other words, according to this school, or like heat exists by way of its own character. Fire exists by way of its own characteristic, according to school. But fire doesn't exist by way of its own characteristic as the referent for the term fire. So this school would say, so Chitamatrans would say, oh, things do exist by way of their own characteristic. And they have characteristics that, that exist by way of their own nature. But they don't exist by way of their own characteristic as the referent for language and terms. Does that answer you? So it's a subtle distinction that they draw, but an important one. But does that answer your question or no?
Yes, it does actually. I think I'm a closet Chitamatrans.
It's a wonderful school of thinking.
Yeah.
The more I study it, the more I think, wow,
Yeah.
it seems simple and it's not. It's very
Yeah, it's not. No, that does help. Thank you. I mean, obvious for me, the Chittamatrin helps a lot with respect to understanding that whenever I'm seeing something, it's not separate from my own mind, and then I can get at my own craziness with that understanding. It's a little tougher to do that with respect to the Prajnanika view. When you're trying to deal with your own emotional stuff. No, thank you. That does help.
Yeah, and I'll just say very briefly, like that makes sense, and also like I said this early on, like that well, actually, I think I even gave that example. I just thought of it again. One thing like my probably say my closest friend, who's a practitioner in the Kagyu tradition. We often talk about Dharma, and anyway, I mean, one of the things I love about him is he'll say like, I've decided for now I'm Chittamatrin. That's what I'm gonna, even like he said, because that's what's helping me practice. And he's like, is the Madhyamaka correct philosophically or something more correct? And he said, I don't care right this moment. What's actually helping me sit and practice is Chittamatrin view. So for now, I'm a Chittamatrin, and he said, that's going to be the foundation of my practice today, because it's what's actually helping my mental afflictions to get less, and it's helping me actually sit and do, in his case, it was Mahamudra or something, he's like, and I was like, I love that, because it's very authentic, and it's like about what's actually helping my mind. And he said, my guru says Madhyamaka is the final school. And of course, he says he's probably right, but for today, that's not, that's just going to make me intellectualized, and what's actually helping me practice is this. So this is what I'm going to practice today. I don't disagree with my guru, but that's not what's helping my mind today. And I think it's great. I always, I love that, because it's about, because the whole point is, it doesn't help your mental afflictions decrease, right? Yeah, John.
Yeah, I'm going to, I guess, build on what you said, because the question was already there. I mean, is the premise that by learning about these different schools, the tenets, we should be thinking of almost say like picking and choosing, what makes the most sense for us at a moment in time, if that helps us better dealing with our understandings. And so, I know that the Dalai Lama always says, whenever I've seen him, he talks about, you should listen to what I say and then decide if you believe it and make it part of you. And that there is, Galupa school's got a set tradition, which some of these might be outside that. Does that matter?
I'll say it this way, like, one is, obviously, like if you're thinking the Galupa school, right, everybody in the Galupa school would say, oh, in the end, you study Chandrakirti, and you study Nagarjuna, and in the end, you're Madhyamaka. But I often think of this, like, if you spend time actually with like Tibetan, with monks, I'm using an example of Galupa tradition, right? Like, think about that, like, they spend like not just months, but years, actually, right? Like, they spend years on Abhidharma, like where they're going off and studying that, or years studying, or months, they go off and do like debate and the pramana and so on, which are not Madhyamaka treatises, so like, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Like that even the, if you ask a Geshe, what's the final view of reality, there's no Galupa Geshe, he's not going to say Madhyamaka, of course, but the truth is they spend years studying the other tenet systems and practicing them, and they know them very, very well. And so I think even, even for them, actually, like they practice they practice these other tenet systems, and they study Vinaya, for example, right? Which is, the Vinaya is a Vaibhashika set of texts, texts that come from the Vaibhashika tradition, one of the Vaibhashika sub-traditions. So I guess my point is that even the monks actually practice all the tenet systems to some extent. So yeah, I think the idea is that, if you're gonna, so there's a sense in which in the literature you would say, when it comes to the final view, one wants to eventually understand the Prasangika view, but in terms of practice, sure, as at any given moment, if a different tenet system is what helps us, then we should practice that, isn't it? Like, is one point. And the other point I'll make is that many geshes have pointed out is, I just read this yesterday, because I was praying for this class. I mean, where one geshe was saying this point, he said, like, so one point is, yes, whichever school helps you practice, and is what you should use in that moment. But the other point one geshe was pointing out, which I liked, was he said, how do you put it? He said, it's often said that the Prasangika Madhyamaka system is the highest of all the tenet systems. Then he says, how in the, he didn't put it, it wasn't this blunt, but he basically said, but how in the world can you personally know that if you haven't studied the other tenet systems? And actually Lama Tsongkhapa says the same thing. It's really funny. In his teachings on Tantra, he says, everybody says Tantra is the highest vehicle of the most exalted, or most fastest path, and the most exalted path. The highest yoga tantra is faster than the other tantras. And then he says, but how can you personally know that if you haven't studied the other time? He says, how can you know that highest yoga tantra is how and why highest yoga tantra is the fastest approach to enlightenment if you haven't studied the other approaches? Then he says, then for you it would just be words, right? Tsongkhapa kind of points this out, sort of thing. So anyway, the point is, I think that one benefit of studying the other tenet systems is sometimes that's what we need to practice in the moment to help us overcome a certain mental affliction. But the other is that if you want to really understand the Prasangika Madhyamaka view, let's say, right? Then, as they're pointing out, you won't really, you won't understand its unique tenets and unique points if you haven't understood grosser ones, because you won't really be able to appreciate the subtlety. That's what that geshe was implying. Was implicitly, he was explicitly saying, using this implicit and explicit, right? He was explicitly saying, you'll understand its uniqueness better if you've studied the other. But he was also implying, right, that you get my point. So. Anyway, yeah, so there are a number of benefits to studying these topics there. And then Sujata.
I think I'm having trouble understanding what is meant in the school by something existing by way of its own characteristics. So I can see how we get to the idea that that phenomena are empty of existing by their own characteristic as referent for names and terms, but they posit that things do exist by way of their own characteristics. So like if you could use the example, maybe blue and then mind, as how do they believe that things exist? How do they believe that blue exists by way of its own characteristic? And then how would they say that mind exists by way of its own characteristic?
What they're getting at in a way is this: is that I think, so I'll say, sort of start with the part, see if this starts to answer it or not. What they would say, I'll use the example of pick the example of mind, because that's one of the two that you mentioned. And what this would say is like, they would say things do exist by way of their own characteristic, because otherwise you would be it would be nihilistic. And then also things wouldn't depend upon karma if they didn't exist by way of their own characteristic. And an example would be like, so like if I were to say, Sujata is a sentient being who has a mind, right? And so then I would have to say, well, that's a true statement, based on, and like, so they're training in bodhicitta, right? So they would say she's a sentient being who has a mind, and therefore it could be the basis for my training in bodhicitta. I hope I want to benefit Sujata and help her become a Buddha or something, right? But then if you were to say, let's say, and they would say, because otherwise a person could say, oh, well, my mala has a mind, because I said it does. And then they would say, no, because that doesn't exist by way of its own characteristic as having a mind. You know, as you said the words, it has a mind, but it doesn't have the characteristic from its own side of having a mind. So it's not the basis for, you know, if you were to say, I'm going to try to become a Buddha to enlighten my mala, that's ludicrous in a way because it doesn't have a mind by way of its own characteristic. And in the same way, right, like now going back to your example of blue, like, you know, blue existing as the referent for the term blue doesn't exist by its own characteristic, right? But they would say, but of course, blue itself exists by its own characteristic because the person who has the karma to see, you know, like sentient beings on this planet have a certain karma where they see the sky as blue, right? And that's based on, you know, group karma. And if somebody then came along and said, no, the sky is actually, you know, on a clear, warm summer day, the sky is, at noon, the sky is, I don't know, purple. You know, you would say, well, it doesn't exist as purple by way of its own characteristic. That's not the karmic, that's not the appearance, and that's not the karma, that's just made up. So things do have their own characteristic, because, you know, and the traditional example they give, I'll give one last point. The traditional example they give is they say, you know, if you they give an example where they say you have to differentiate, like if you see a rabbit in your yard, right? You know, does that rabbit exist separate from the entity of mind? No. Does it exist as, you know, like, and so on, all those points, right? Does it exist as the, from its own characteristic as the basis for the term rabbit? No. But does it exist by way of its own characteristic as a rabbit? Yes, because it serves the function of a rabbit. It's not a python, right? It's not going to eat your pets or something, you know, or is it's going to eat grass. It has its own, so it exists by way of its own characteristic, because otherwise anything could be any, according to this school, otherwise anything could be anything. There'll be a kind of, on the one hand, it'll be a kind of nihilism, on the other hand, it'll be a kind of radical relativism that doesn't relate to how things actually function. So that's why things exist by way of their own characteristic, is as a way of, I mean, that's not why they present that way, because otherwise they would say, otherwise you're being nihilistic. Of course, you know that a Protestant Majamaka would disagree with them on this point, but you can see that what they're saying actually is quite, I mean, when you actually, you know, when you present it that way, actually, right, like there's that, you know, a rabbit exists by way of its own characteristic and isn't a python because it has the character, you know, it serves the function and has the characteristics from its own, you know, of a rabbit, in that sense that it, you know, and so on. You know, in the example of like Sudatta has a mind, but the mala doesn't, you can see what they're getting at, right? In other words, they're saying things do exist by way of their own characteristics, but if I were to say this is a mala by way of its own characteristic as the label of the term mala, that becomes problematic, right? Because not everybody calls it a mala, because if you separate the parts, you know, they're not a mala, and so on. There are many reasons why that's not reasonable. But you know, like if you hold these two objects up, right, one has from its own characteristic, you know, characteristic of a mala, and the other has its own characteristic of a pen, and there's a difference. And they would say you can't just say this is a mala, that it doesn't have the characteristics of that. You know, so that's one point. The different point is, does this exist by way of its own characteristics? It's a referent in the term pen. That it doesn't, because not everybody calls it a pen, because pen is a made-up term, and so on. That's, you know, came in a certain time and place and language and all that. So you see the difference there. Yeah. Yeah, without that, they would say it's nihilism. That's important. Now, other comments or questions? We'll go a little further. Okay. So the last section of this, the last of the 7 headings under Chittamatra is their presentation of the grounds and paths. And it says, this is explained in 2 parts, objects of abandonment and the actual presentation of the grounds and paths. So first comes the objects of abandonment. And then, so first it says, objects of abandonment. The concept of a self of persons together with its seeds, and the three poisons arising due to the force of that conception, together with their seeds, are posited to be afflictive obscurations. And so I just want to say, so just to remind people, right? So afflictive obscurations, right, are sometimes you can say, they're the mental afflictions, or they're the things that have to be abandoned to achieve liberation from suffering, right? Which are different from the next will be the obscurations to knowledge, right? So the afflictive obscurations are actual afflictions that cause suffering, that serve as the causes of suffering. And so according to this school, right, what are those? The ones that are afflictive obscurations, which are the causes of suffering. So the most important one, right, is the conception of a self of persons, right? And so that would be, you know, the gross and the subtle that we already mentioned. So the gross, right, the permanent unitary independent sense of self, and is the gross one, and then the subtle self-sufficient sense of self is the subtle one. So particularly the self-sufficient substantially existent, the subtle self of persons, is an object of abandonment that's an afflictive obscuration, right? So as long as you grasp at that self-sufficient substantially existent sense of self, that serves as a cause of suffering, right? So it has to be abandoned on the path, and the way you abandon it is you gain what we mentioned earlier, the yogic direct perception, realizing the subtle selflessness of persons, right? And when you realize that, you begin to eliminate that subtle conception of a self of persons. Now here it says also the seeds, right? So, and that's why actually, you know, that's why a bodhisattva, you know, the first time you realize the subtle self as a person's in yogic direct perception, you're not yet liberated from samsara because you still have the seeds, right, of that. And so by continually meditating on the yogic direct perception of the subtle selves as a persons, you eliminate the conception of a self of persons and its seeds, along with, and then it says, along with the three poisons, right? So the three poisons, right? Some different translations, but desire, craving, hatred or anger, or sometimes they translate different ways, and ignorance, right? So you eliminate those and their seeds, right? And in that way, you become liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering, right? Of the Four Noble Truths, you know, so and so on. So, and another point I wanted to make here is seeds, right? Just what does it mean by seeds? And I just want to point this out. So seeds mean you're not just eliminating, say, the anger, but this gets at, you know, we've talked about this term before, cessations, right? So in other words, that you eliminate the seeds. A seed is an, you could say, is an imprint or something in the mind, or in the alaya, in this school, in the true aspectarian's case, that leads to future arising of the conception of the self of persons. Does that make sense? So it's not enough, like, because when a person's in a state, let's say, of yogic direct realization, it's non-dualistic, right? So they're in this kind of experience in that moment of a non-dualistic state of realizing the lack of a subtle self of persons. They don't have an experience of a self of persons at the first time they realize that, but they do have its seeds. So when they come out of meditative equipoise, their sense of a self of persons will reassert itself. And so eventually they have to eliminate the seeds of that so that they'll no longer have a grasping, self-grasping at a self of persons. So you have to eliminate both the explicit mental afflictions, but also their seeds in order to become liberated. So those are the objects of abandonment. Does that make sense? For the afflictive obscurations. And when you've eliminated all of those, you're liberated from samsara. You no longer suffer. Then it says, the conception of things as being true, together with the seeds and latencies, the seeds, with its seeds, the latencies of that conception, and all mistaken dualistic appearances that arise due to the force of that, are posited as obscurations to knowledge. So now, and again, it's just, like, put this in context for a second. if you're a practitioner of, a Shravaka vehicle, right? Like, so your goal is to become, or a Prajika Buddha vehicle, right? So if your goal is just to achieve your own liberation, then all you want to do is get rid of the afflictive obscurations, the first paragraph there, right? That's enough because you're liberated from suffering, and your goal is that. If that makes sense. That's your personal goal. But if you want to become a Buddha, then you have to eliminate the obscurations to knowledge, which means, or you could say the obscurations to omniscience, right? So if you want to become a Buddha, that's why it takes longer to become a Buddha. You have to eliminate also the obscurations to knowledge, or the obscurations to omniscience, which is an ability, right, which eliminate these obscurations so that you can see all phenomena, and know and be flawless in your ability to benefit others. So that's one point, right? So here it says the concept. So, and according to this school, which is different than the Majjhimaka one, Prasangika Majjhimaka, I want to point out, but according to the Chittamatrans, one has to realize the selflessness of persons to eliminate the afflictive obscurations and achieve liberation, as we just said. But to achieve the omniscient state of a Buddha, you also have, that's where the selfless of phenomena comes in. So the second paragraph is addressing the selfless of phenomena. So it's pointing out that for bodhisattvas, they have to emphasize meditation also on the selflessness of phenomena in order to achieve omniscience. And what this, now I'm going to go through this paragraph again and explain. That was context, so you can understand the paragraph well. So now here, the conception, so now it's saying, right, I'm going to reread it. The conception of things as being true together with its seeds. The latencies of that conception, right? And all mistaken dualistic appearances that arise due to the force of that are positive obscurations of knowledge. So I want to point out here something important to understand this paragraph, which is there's a difference between seeds and latencies. And it's a term that's used here, but you won't understand the paragraph well if you don't get that point. So a seed, in the language of this translation, is call it like an imprint of having previous, in this case, let me use the example of self-grasping, right? Is an imprint from previous self-grasping that can give rise to a future, that will give rise to a future experience of self-grasping. Does that make sense? So it's a seed will actually give rise to a result of a similar type, right? Or a seed of anger will give rise to future anger. A seed of desire will give rise to future desire, and so on. So the seed of the mental afflictions will give rise to future mental afflictions. The latency will not give rise to future mental afflictions, but it gives rise, as this paragraph says, to dualistic appearances. And the analogy that's often given that I think it's an analogy that Tibetan lamas sometimes use, is the difference, like if you have a clove of garlic, right? A clove of garlic is like a seed in the sense that it's a root actually, I guess, but it can give rise to future garlic plants. Does that make sense? And then more, and if you cultivate it, you can, if you have a single clove of garlic and you plant it, you can have a garlic plant. And eventually that can lead to many other cloves of garlic, right? So that's the equivalent of a seed in the sense that it can give rise to more of its own type. The latency is more like if you chopped garlic in a bowl and then you burned it, you cooked it and ate it or something, right? And then you have the bowl. The bowl still smells of garlic. That smell is not going to give rise to a garlic plant ever, right? But it still smells. And that's the analogy for a latency that they use. So the latency cannot give rise to another thing of the same type that caused it, but it's a leftover latency, or leftover, in the case of garlic smell or something, right? It's a leftover imprint or something of that having been in the bowl, but it can't give rise to something else. So the point being, Prajeka Buddhas and Arhats don't have seeds anymore of the mental afflictions, but they do have the latencies. They don't eliminate those latencies, right? Bodhisattvas who want to become Buddhas have to eliminate the latencies in order to achieve omniscience. And so So now that hopefully this paragraph makes sense, right? So they meditate on, the selflessness phenomena that we've been talking about. And in this school, the view is that by meditating on that selflessness phenomena, you're eliminating the latencies, right, of the mental afflictions. And you're therefore eliminating all, as it says here, all dualistic appearances. So for a Buddha, there are no dualistic appearances. And at that level of Buddhahood, only at that level, really, to think this permanently, what does it say, right? Bodhisattvas, while they're in meditative equipoise on selflessness or emptiness, dualistic appearances, I said, like water poured into water, dualistic appearances temporarily stop, but then they arise from that meditation, and again, they have dualistic appearances. But a Buddha has no mistaken dualistic appearances. So for a Buddha, and anyway, they've eliminated the latencies, that's the way to put it, and therefore achieve omniscience. So that's what this is saying, is those are both, so the objects, to be going back now, the objects of abandonment according to the school, for bodhisattvas and also for practitioners of the Pratyeka Buddha and the vehicle of the listeners, they all want to abandon the first set, right? The conception of a self of persons and the three poisons, right? All the afflictive obscurations. And then uniquely, bodhisattvas want to get rid of the latencies as well. So that's that. And then it says now the actual presentation of the grounds and paths. And so here it makes, actually it just elaborates on what I just said. So those of the hearer, right, the Shravaka, the hearer lineage, that's the people who want to become a arhat, right, achieve their own individual liberation. It says those of the hearer lineage can join the view realizing the selfless of persons with a small accumulation of merit for the sake of their own welfare, right? So again, as I just said, right, so if somebody wants to achieve their own liberation as a hearer, then, those are the people who, like the arhats, who followed the Buddha around and listened, and they're called hearers, right, both because they listen to the actual Buddha, and then also they help others hear. They went around and said, the Buddha taught me this, and they help others in that way. So they have to realize the view of selflessness and accumulate a small accumulation of merit, right? And below it says here, I think it usually takes 3 lifetimes around, or it could take more, but it says at least, I think, where is it? Anyway, around 3 lifetimes. While those of the solitary realizer, Pratyeka Buddha in Sanskrit lineage, can join that same thing, right? The view realizing self as a persons with a middling accumulation of merit for the sake of their own welfare. So, somebody who wants to achieve Pratyeka Buddhahood, the realization according to the school is the same. It's the self as a persons. Right? The difference is they accumulate more merit. Oh, and here it is. So it says here. And so it differentiates, and it depends upon, so here it explains this length of time. So for the listeners, it's at least 3 lifetimes. According to, they say listeners or hearers have to accumulate merit for at least 3 lifetimes. Solitary realizers or Pratyeka Buddhas accumulate merit for 100 eons. And then by realizing the selflessness of persons, they eliminate the afflictive obscurations that we just mentioned, right? By realizing the selflessness of persons, and they actualize, it says here, their respective enlightenments. So that paragraph, I think, is clear. Now it's going to differentiate. Bodhisattvas, on the other hand, can join their view realizing apprehenders and apprehendeds to be empty of being different substances, right? So they have to, so it's pointing out, right? What is it saying? They have to, bodhisattvas have to meditate. They also meditate on selfless persons, but they mainly have to spend a long time meditating on emptiness of phenomena, right? So it's the emptiness of apprehended and apprehender being separate entities, right? That's that form of emptiness in the mind-only school. Being different substances with a great accumulation of merit. And their difference also is for the sake of others' welfare, right? So the previous 2 mainly practice for the sake of their own welfare. Bodhisattvas mainly practice for the sake of others' welfare. And in dependence upon having cultivated that for at least 3 countless great eons and so on, actualize their respective life. So now it's clear, right? So this, according to this school, a hearer or Shravaka practices accumulating merit for at least 3 lifetimes, realizes the self as the persons, and achieves liberation. A solitary realizer or Pratyeka Buddha accumulates merit and virtue for 100 eons, realizes the selflessness of persons, and achieves their own personal liberation. A bodhisattva practices for 3 countless great eons, right? Practices the 6 perfections for 3 countless great eons. Also, like the others, realizes the selflessness of persons, but particularly meditates on the emptiness of phenomena and thereby achieves his or her own respective enlightenment, which is Buddhahood. And then it says, this actually, we'll just complete this. We'll complete it today because the last part is very, So it says that according to, I'll just summarize this last part. So what it's saying here is that true aspectarians and false aspectarians have a difference. Then they all agree on those previous points, but there's a difference in their tenets slightly among those 2 sub-schools. And the basic difference actually is 3 vehicles. I'm going to say, there's more details here, but I'll basically say it this way. 3 vehicles and final vehicles and 1 final vehicle. The true aspectarians say there are 3 final vehicles. So what they say is if you achieve the state of an arhat because you're a practitioner of the hero vehicle, then you're done. That's the end. And that's your, they say here, that's your kind of, that's your disposition in your alaya, and that's your path, and that's your result. And when you achieve that, that's the end of your path and the end of your samsara, and that's that. For Pratyeka Buddha, the same thing. And for Bodhisattva, they achieve Buddhahood, and that's there at the end of their vehicle. False aspectarians say, no, there's 1 final vehicle. Everyone eventually becomes a Buddha. So that's a difference. Does that make sense? So again, true aspectarians say each practitioners of each of those 3 vehicles end in their own enlightenment, and that's sort of the final culmination. Whereas for false aspectarians, the view is even if you achieve arhatship, then after a long period of time, eventually a Buddha will come and kind of awaken you from your samadhi of liberation and say, others, there's more to be done. Others still need your help. Even a Pratyeka Buddha, right? They'll say Pratyeka Buddha achieves their own liberation and is in this kind of, subtle state of liberation. And eventually a Buddha comes to them and says, you're not finished. Others need help. You have to complete your path and become a Buddha. So that's the false aspectarian view. True aspectarians don't agree with that. And so another point that they make here is that according to false aspectarians, therefore, when somebody's say you are practicing the hero lineage, right? When you achieve your final, when that person achieves the cessation of all suffering and the cause of suffering, they achieve liberation. And it says here, the continuum of their mental afflictions ends, but it says here, the continuum of their mere awareness goes on, right? So in other words, they have it after they've achieved liberation, they no longer take rebirth in the typical sense, and they don't take rebirth in samsara for sure, but they have a mere awareness, right? Because the ending of their mental affliction doesn't end their awareness. And it's that awareness that can be awakened by a Buddha to then, and then they practice the Bodhisattva path, the various perfections, and they achieve Buddhahood. And then going backwards for a second, the true aspectarians, they're more similar actually to the Hinayana tenets in the sense that, we covered this in the Vaibhashika school. Their view is that they don't agree. Part of the reason they don't accept the 1 final vehicle view is they think that like the Vaibhashikas did, that here when they achieve liberation and they die, their kind of continuum ends. When a Pratyeka Buddha achieves liberation and then they die, their continuum ends. So they don't think there is a mere awareness there for the Buddha to awaken. The false aspectarians say there is. And so those are the differences there. And the last 2 things to cover, and then we're done with the mind-only school. Another is there can be another is here, it mentions, under the true aspectarian's point, it says, I'll read this line actually. They assert that it is impossible to sever the continuum of awareness of a Buddha superior, because they assert that for the Bodhisattva who attained enlightenment initially as a complete enjoyment body in Akanishta, the continuum of a similar type of that complete enjoyment body is not severed as long as samsara is not empty, but rather it enacts the welfare of others through various emanations in accordance with the fortunes of each individual disciple. So just to briefly mention, what this is getting at is the 4 kayas, right? And it's just worth mentioning briefly before we stop that so sometimes they're taught as 3 kayas, sometimes it's 4, sometimes 2. Actually, there are different ways to teach it. You can do it according to, they're all the same teaching, but you can categorize them as 2 or as 3 or as 4, so on. But in brief, what this is getting at is a unique tenet, since we're doing tenets of the Mahayana schools, is that a Buddha has, I'll say 4 kayas here, because that's the way it's mentioned. And so there's the Dharmakaya, right? And then here what's mentioned is the Sambhogakaya and the Nirmanakaya. And so I'll just mention that briefly, because this is a unique tenet of the Mahayana, right? So the Mahayana says that the Buddhas, and even among the Dharmakaya, you can separate it into the jhana, wisdom Dharmakaya, and the nature Dharmakaya. But anyway, so you can do it. That's how you do 4. You want to say 4, but that's not all mentioned here. What's mentioned here is the complete enjoyment body. Okay, so the complete enjoyment body, which actually Bob Thurman translates that as body of beatitude. It's funny, but usually it's translated complete enjoyment body. So according to this school, when a Buddha achieves Buddhahood, right, you could say their mind becomes the Dharmakaya. But then they also achieve a complete enjoyment body, which is a subtle body that exists, as it says here, in Akanishta Pure Land. So it exists in a Pure Land. And it has 5 certainties, and I'll just mention those briefly. It has the certainty of place, which is Akanishta Pure Land. It has the certainty of Dharma, which is it only teaches the Mahayana Dharma. It has the certainty of retinue, which is it only teaches Arya Bodhisattvas. It has the certainty of body, which is that body, the pure enjoyment body, has the 32 signs and the 80 marks or exemplifications of a fully enlightened being. And as mentioned here, it has a certainty of time, which is it remains for as long as samsara exists. And then as it says here, that complete enjoyment body emanates out emanation bodies, right, which are nirmanakaya, emanation bodies. So according to the Mahayana, right, there's the Buddha's mind, and then the Buddha manifests this kind of complete enjoyment body in a Pure Land. But that body in a Pure Land, as it says, can only teach, only Arya Bodhisattvas are capable of interacting with that complete enjoyment body. So it benefits them, but the Buddha's compassion doesn't only extend to them, it extends to beings like us who are in grosser realms and don't have the merit and the wisdom to be able to see a complete enjoyment body. So then that complete enjoyment body is said to send out emanations, countless emanations to different planets and different worlds and different continents and different realms to teach beings, right, and to benefit beings and to help enlighten beings. So this is getting at this unique tenet of the Mahayana tenet systems, which is this kayas, the various kayas. So the idea, though, there is that, right, is basically that a Buddha, and so all the schools agree on, all the Mahayana schools agree that a Buddha exists, once somebody achieves Buddhahood, they continue to exist until all beings are liberated from samsara. And they continue to, on the one hand, they have this kind of emanation, or this kind of complete enjoyment body that will remain in that Pure Land for as long as there are bodhisattvas, right, who need benefit. And then we'll send out emanation bodies or nirmanakayas to various planets and realms and beings until those beings are liberated from samsara. And so, so the idea there is that a Buddha, continues, continues to emanate and continues to exist. And so the true aspectarians and false aspectarians, differ on this point about do they view as one final vehicle or three final vehicles? And you'll hear those terms. Are there three final vehicles or is there one final vehicle? And the one final vehicle view is that everybody has to eventually become a Buddha. Does that make sense? That's that stance. But then all of these Mahayana schools have the same tenet, which is that the Buddha has the four kayas, and the Buddha manifests and continues on until all beings are liberated. That's the basic view, the basic tenet of all Mahayana schools, is this agreement on that point. Okay, great. Well, and with that, we've completed the Chinamatra, kind of again, not completed in the sense of our practice of it, of course, and not completed all the knowledge of what it teaches, because that's very vast, but we've completed at least, kind of this overview by Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen, right? To kind of reviewing his overview of that school. So then in the next class, we'll start on the middle way school, or the Madhyamaka, which is the final of the four tenet systems. And we'll do, the same 7 points and so on. So we'll look forward to that. Yeah, so we'll do that. The middle way school starting next class. I guess we went over, so we should just do the dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, for it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. For it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrizik Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Well, thanks everybody. Great to see you all. And
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lauren.
yeah, thank you. Have a good, I guess I can't remember when we already have the next class scheduled, but I can't remember. It's not next week, so it's maybe
2 weeks.
2 weeks. 2 weeks. Okay, great.
Okay.
Is that-
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.